It's just such a pleasure to be at this beautiful campus on a beautiful day with a beautiful lot of people, and now I have you all on my side. You will have to listen to me. So, I want to talk to you today using a Black feminist lens, and you'll see the way that we can work through intersectionality when we use this lens. But I want to begin by addressing you as educational professionals, because that's what you do. You're teacher educators, you're working in a teacher education college. So for me, it's particularly exciting to talk to you, because often I'm in other kinds of venues where I have a very different audience. So people that are teacher educators are very close to my heart. And I want to invoke my grandmother just very briefly, who was a teacher educator of sorts at the turn of the 20th century in Trinidad in the Caribbean, where she was converted by the missionaries and became a Bible woman, going out in the bush to teach women to read and write, Indo-Caribbean women and African Caribbean women. And this was, something that's been passed down to me and my family, the knowledge of what she did. And it's really influenced the work that I do, because as a teacher educator, these are the transformative agents of change. They will do the quiet work. They're not out there on the streets rioting and demanding change. Yet they make the small, tiny, incremental acts of love, care and attention that change the world, but become the unsung heroes. We never hear of them, and I call them the quiet riots. People like Ella Barker, who drove the voter registration in the civil rights. We hear of Martin Luther King, but we hardly ever hear of the women behind the scenes that educated and changed the world. So I just want to start by saying that how much that has influenced me, and I hope that you all will have stories to tell about your own family in this way. So I want to begin by thinking through, as educational professionals, how do we enact equality in our complex knowledge economies? Because, things are really changing at a rapid pace in higher education. And, our places of teaching and learning, I would argue, are very much on the borderlands of change. It's where new technology meets the curriculum, meets pedagogic practice, meets globalization. It all comes together in our institutions, particularly when we're doing teaching and learning. And, we so often focus on what we do, our pedagogies and our techniques and our professional practice. I'm sure all those words are very familiar to you, but we far less focus on who we are and our identities and the way what we bring into the classrooms by our embodiment about who we are and how we look, what we represent. And until we come to terms with looking at our identities and our representation in the classroom, I don't think that we can really tackle issues of diversity and equality. And, because so often, and I'm sure all the people that people of colour in the room will know what I mean when I say that we are the diversity workers. We are expected to be the change makers, to bring inclusion and equality to our institutions. And why should it be our responsibility? It is systems of white privilege and institutional racism that really has to be tackled at the core, which is not embodied in us. We become the victims of that, or the receivers of this, but we aren't the perpetrators. So we need to look at the bigger system, which is what I want to look with you today. So I think we have to start by bringing affect or emotions into the picture and focus very much on our affective or emotional feelings in our teaching and learning landscapes, and ask, what are our hopes and dreams? How are our hopes and dreams and our ambitions and our, aspirations bound up into the system. And then secondly, we need to also ask, how is power and privilege, how does power and privilege reproduce inequalities in education through knowledge production? And Vinny and I were just at a very interesting conference on decolonizing the higher education and decolonizing the curriculum. In fact, I brought my new book, which is all about decolonizing higher education. And it is a huge and momentous task. And one of the things that the activists, they were young black scholars, all now just coming up into their careers in higher education, and they were saying, we work so hard to change the institution from the inside, but we're so fragmented, we're so isolated, and then they would talked about their strategies, and some did community action, and some were working on historical projects, but there was no joined upness because we are few in number, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So I really have three aims in this session. I want to look at how race, gender, and class and religion, all those touch words that people bandy around and become buzzwords even, intersectionality, how that intersectionality of our lives are lived realities. How do we live in our institutions? And then I want to ask, how does that work inside these monolithic teaching machines? Because that's what these are, monolithic teaching machines. So we're talking about our identities and how they play out and how they work in our monolithic systems. And how do we find the cracks in the system? And one of the things that I have found so interesting talking to different activists and scholars, because I consider myself an activist scholar, and they all say, where is the fire in our bellies? We used to have it 20 years ago. Where is it now? Is it just a generational thing? I don't know. But the fire in the bellies, the possibility of change, has become more and more difficult as our institutions have morphed into these huge marketized neoliberal institutions where, there's surveillance, there's monitoring, there's accountability, there's TEF, REF, everything, So how do we find cracks in the system where we can enact these equalities truly and deeply and make change? That's a very big question. And how do we keep that fire in our bellies? And other ways of knowing that we have from our experiences, how do we keep those other ways of knowing alive and sustain us through that struggle? I want to argue that that it is a new terrain of struggle that we're in. And I call this, we call it post-race, or you've probably heard about post-feminism, post-race, and some of my students go like, yeah, there's still racism, why is it post-race? And that's exactly the illusion that we're dealing with at the moment, that somehow, after 50 years of equality legislation, and I have to say, the UK, I know where I was going to have a speech about Brexit, but I won't mention the B word, but it's been 50 years since we've had equality legislation in Britain, and it's some of the most progressive equality legislation in the world. And it's also been around 50 years coming, of the civil rights in America. It's been 25 years since the fall of apartheid. So I would argue that we're really at what Stuart Hall calls a specific historical conjecture. We have particular politics of xenophobia. We've got pushing Brexit. We have neoliberal marketization, globalization, mass marketing of universities. All of this is coming together at this moment in time. And we still have our sad old diversity policies that chug along with the system. As Sarah Ahmed says, the performativity of diversity policies enacted by diversity workers, always of colour, black and brown people being the change makers. So we still haven't got the tools. And as Audre Lorde, the black feminist, says, Can the master's tools ever dismantle the master's house? And I would say in this moment in time, we have to ask that question, you know, considering the monolithicness of our institutions. And so we need to really rethink equalities in these so-called post-race times. And by post-race, I'm assuming that most of you must know what I mean, but you know, the idea that Obama can go to the White House or I could be a professor means that somehow we're beyond discrimination. It's a kind of illusion that we have. But you know, there's a huge backlash against diversity policies, affirmative action, and equalities. And it's very much embodied in what I call white hurt or white vulnerability, that somehow they are now the white establishment, or are now the hard done by parties. And we see that also around issues to do with gender, that men are now the underdogs and women now have, you know, getting above themselves and having positions. So I don't want to go into it in a lot of detail other than to say that, you know, at this post-race moment, this backlash is something that we have to really name, and this pernicious discourse of white hate. I don't know if you know Ali Hochschild's work, where she's looking at, you know, white working class Americans in kind of the coal mining areas and so on. And, you know, they say, there's this quote that's quite famous where one of these working class people say, white working class people say, well, you know, we've been standing in the queue for years and years and years. And then somebody like Obama jumps the queue and goes to the front of the queue. And this is something that happens to all of us as people of color. When you achieve something, it's seen as if it's been special pleading, a handout, something that you have got from the white establishment that has meant it's a zero-sum game, that they've lost out because you've got something. And when I got my chair over 20 years ago, it was one of the first chairs, well, it was the first chair in race equality in the world, and there was a celebration afterwards, and this white male professor came up to me, and very well known, very well established person, and we were all having drinks, and he came up to me and he whispered in my ear, they're giving chairs to anyone for anything these days. And he was so bitter and angry. I mean, he had his bloody chair. I mean, you know, it wasn't like I'd taken anything, but, you know, he felt that I hadn't worked for it. And this is one of the issues that I think is very important in thinking through our position as professionals in the business that we do, is that, you know, meritocracy is the golden yardstick of higher education. It really is. You know, we all aspire that we should do well, that our children should do well. And we buy into a system that, you know, of more and more qualifications. Yet meritocracy, in my new book, it's an edited book, and Diane Ray has written a beautiful chapter on the elite universities. You know, the idea that, you know, there are the deserving and the undeserving. And merit is somehow a level playing field. And it's about ability and talent to get in, not about class and cultural capital and status. And so we need to unpack that, because actually meritocracy is one of the most pernicious illusions that we have in higher education. But what we have here, these are the students at the I2M Oxford, and what happened in, I'm going to say 1915, but it's 2015, I'm in another century. But in 2015, there was a huge groundswell of students of colour from all over the world saying we've had enough. And if you think of this 50 years of equalities, and, you know, a generation has grown up believing, being told that, you know, you get what you deserve. If you study well, you can enter the, I don't know, the White House or the Vice Chancellor's rooms. You know, you too can make it to the top. And yet, they're not seeing this. So in 2015, the students in South Africa, they had the Rose Must Fall movement, which was a huge, and the fees must fall, because fees is a whole nother area of disadvantage as well for our students. And they tore down the statue of Cecil Rhodes, that vile racist that, that has been, honoured in their universities, in their halls, in their funding and so on, as a statement of their black pain, what they call it. I went to South Africa and visited the students there and the vice chancellors of all the universities, all the black vice chancellors of universities last year, and it was the most amazing experience, because the students, they rose up against the establishment and they put their studies and themselves on the line. And the university brought in private security companies and demolished them. And those students, how many years on are we? 5 years on nearly, they all were taken to court. They've become decimated. They haven't been able to finish their studies. They are got criminal records, and the lecturers and the staff, I met many of them that were involved in the activism. They're down in the basement, marking papers. They won't have academic careers, and they're brilliant. They're brilliant scholars. So there's a huge price that the students paid. And yet we were talking about activism. The price that you pay for standing your ground and not towing the diversity line is enormous in your institution. You will be sacked. You will... these students, they're in debt because of the lawyers' fees. Their parents have been bankrupted through it. So the euphoria of the moment had a payback. And I think that's always important to remember. But the idea of these post-race eduscapes comes from the work of Elspeth Probyn. And Elspeth Probyn talks about affect. And affect is the emotions and the feelings and within that are embodied in our institutions. And she talks of affective eduscapes. And an eduscape is this kind of idea of the university commodifying and marketizing the hopes and the dreams of these international students, of poor students, of, opening your doors and widening participation, and you're saying, come in, we'll take your money. We will manufacture a dream for you. And so you buy the dream. That's the cruelty of meritocracy. And the eduscape is that, I was using a metaphor of a net the other day. It's like, when you go fishing, you throw the net out and you pull in those hopes and dreams, and then you turn it into money. You turn it into a commodity, which is our education system. And this is what neoliberalism does. And the student now is constructed very much as a free-floating, unattached individual. And I think that's a very powerful construction, where they can, if they fail, they have, firstly, they have choice and freedom, and that's the illusion. And yet, if they fail, they have limiting self-beliefs. It's because you couldn't make it. You didn't have enough aspirations. Not that the systems and the structures have contained you and not giving you a fair opportunity. So it becomes your problem, not the institution's problem. So I've just examined a thesis in Finland, and she talks about the way that refugees and migrants are brought into Finland, and then they're sent on particular education programs that only migrants and criminals are sent on. And then, they have to keep doing modules because they will never get a job. They keep doing it, and every time they fail or whatever, they're sent back again. But they're always told you failed because they weren't good enough, not because they're on a crap course that's going nowhere. So this is how the system works. The affect, and then they partake in it because they don't want to disappoint their family. They want to succeed. So your ideas of success are bound into that system. So I think this is a very important combination of the promise of hope, the illusion of choice, and meritocracy that's at the heart of our education system. And we can't think about equalities and diversity and inclusion without deconstructing that at the very heart. So, so what is it like to be inside the teaching machine? Different experiences for different people. But I love this quote, one of my favorite books, and if you can get your library to get Kathleen Casey's I Answer With My Life. It's a very old book from 1993, and but it's just incredible. It's about these teachers answering with their life to the, the call to teach. They are black women teachers, they are Jewish women, Catholic nuns. She looks at a whole range. She does a research with a whole range of different women teachers, and she says, about the young black women, she says, they set off into the white world carrying expectations of mythic proportions. Their odysseys, they believe, will transform their life. But separated from their cultural communities, these young women's passages turn out to be isolated, individual journeys into the heart of whiteness. And that's I think it's a really powerful statement, because you can deconstruct that and see so many levels. The hopes and the dreams. You enter into a world, and this can be true for working class white young people as well in our institutions. You set off with these dreams that somehow you will transform your life. But when you leave your communities, you can never go back. And one thing that Bell Hooks, who's a black feminist, talks about is going to the other side of the tracks. You walk, she did. She moved over from the railway tracks. And when she moved over to the other side of the railway tracks, she couldn't go back anymore because she had changed and transformed herself. So you move yourself away from your roots and who you are. And that brings with it a certain amount of pain and dissonance that, that's so difficult to talk about, because it could lead to mental health, it could lead to depression, it could lead to all sorts of things. And another very famous black woman scholar called Patricia Williams, she talks about, the violence to the self that this disjuncture brings about, this movement. It's a kind of, she says, it's a wonderful piece. She's a lawyer, a scholar of law, and she says, that some days, she says, she's so angry, she's so upset after a day at work because of the way that she's been treated as a black woman. And she said that she can't even utter a kind word to her own family. And that when she's walking home, she would look in the, not in the mirror, but in the glass, in shop front windows, and see her reflection. And she says, I see my reflection, and then I remember I'm a whole person. Because she feels all fragmented, and, so this sense of what it is like to be the one in a million, which is what I describe. I've written a chapter called One in a Million. What is it like to be the only person in a department who is put upon to do all the diversity work, to do all the diversity teaching? What does that mean? And, it is a shameful thing in the British education system that, there are 17,000 professors in the UK. 12,000 are white men. 4,000 are white women. 345 are women of colour. And of that, 30 are of black African descent. 5 are Bangladeshi, 10 are Indian, and 10 are Pakistani, and 80 are Indian, and 75 are Chinese. Or, you know, I mean, it's ridiculous, the statistics. And people like me and Sarah Ahmed and, you know, many of us who are professors who've been there have left early. We've taken early, we've resigned, we've chucked our jobs in because the pressure is too much to bear, as Patricia Williams points out. So to be one in a million, what Nirmal Puwar, who's written again brilliantly, another post-colonial scholar of colour, she says, you know, that we are black bodies out of space. She actually says this wonderful, you know, illustration of being a space invader. We are space invaders in places of whiteness that are become sedimented historically over time, that only certain bodies can occupy certain positions and others can't. And it's just like, you know, I know that if I went for a job as a VC, which I have thought about, how would I be perceived in a lineup with my white male colleagues? Can she do it? Can she really? Does she really embody authority? Will she be able to handle it? You know, there will be so many questions. I'm sure she cooks better than she writes, or, you know, or something. There won't be the expectation that I can deliver. And hey, I have to really care to put myself in that position, because what it's going to do to my family and me will be unsurmountable. And is it worth it? And many of us have said no, and we've walked away. And there's a study by Louise Morley on women in leadership in higher education, not just women of colour, but all women. And they all say this. They reach a point and they go, is it worth it? What I have to go through. It isn't that we can't hack it, but is it worth it? And they go, no, I've got one life and I'm going to live it with my family. And, you know, so this idea that we have low aspirations, it actually is that the institution is not welcoming and doesn't believe in us. So I think that this idea of the outsider within, what is it like to be within, is a very powerful and interesting thing for us to think about. So I want us to move on and think about how do we engage with different kinds of knowledges in our institutions. So we have a lot of, you know, buzzwords at the moment. Intersectionality has become a buzzword, even though it's a very important concept. But also decolonizing, and I'll just get my new book because the camera's on me. So just published this, and we're having the roadshow. In fact, this is part of the roadshow to publicize the book, but it's called Dismantling Race in Higher Education, Racism, Whiteness, and Decolonizing the Academy. So decolonizing is the latest buzzword, and it's kind of anti-racism 2020, because basically it's saying, let us look at the colonial, let us have a post-colonial thought revolution in our institutions. And, you know, the press has been awful about it. They say, well, you want to kick out white men, you know, all this scholarship, and that's not what it's about. It's about actually saying, let's look at what we teach and how we teach in different ways. And I just want to give you an example of that, looking at these post-colonial disjunctures that occur when we, if you like, erase and ignore certain kinds of knowledge, what Gayatri Spivak, again a post-colonial scholar, calls the epistemic violence of erasure of our histories and our knowledge. It's like additional to the white knowledge. In fact, as I was saying, I come from Trinidad and the Caribbean, and our great scholars like C.L.R. James and Stuart Hall, and they're all men, but there is Sylvia Wynter and others, you know, they, and V.S. Naipaul, interesting person, but you know, they all were schooled, as I was in the Caribbean, in English history, in Shakespeare, and the master's voice. We learnt the master's voice, and what is very interesting about that is what Du Bois calls double consciousness and Fanon calls, you know, this misrecognition. So we are schooled in this way of thinking, in the European Enlightenment way of thinking, and we're also, our own identities are erased, our cultures. This is what colonialism has done, and this is the tool of colonialism, how it works its magic on people. How do you become subjected to an oppressive system? Is that you remove the person's identity and you replace it with yours, so that you become a mimic man, as Homi Bhabha says. You walk in their image. So this is a very interesting way in which, and you know, if you look at domestic violence situations where women are repeatedly abused and told they're nothing and hit and beaten, which is what the colonial oppressors did, then that person is subjected to your desires. She becomes, or the people of color become, you know, dehumanized and able to be manipulated, able to be, you know, contained. So it's a very powerful, to negate people's histories in such a conscious way, which the British education system has over time, is an epistemic violence. And I want to point to you this amazing picture. So in 2003, I was on a commission for African Asian heritage and bringing African and Asian history into the libraries, into the schools and whatever. It was the Mayor's Commission, it was under Livingstone's day. and we used to get all these amazing trips to places that I hadn't been, like the Museum of London. And because I thought the Museum of London had nothing to do with me and my history, because, you know, but of course it does. And right at the very back, in the suffragettes section, was this photograph of the Indian women suffragettes. And in 1911, these are the Bambara sisters, Sophie Bambara and the Dilip Singh sisters. And they were really heavily involved in the suffragette movement. And in fact, you know, were fined and had, you know, they were part of those who were being imprisoned and so on. And, you know, I love this quote by Lata Mani, also a post-colonial scholar of color. She says, you know, as women of color, when we're in this society, there's this juncture between how I see myself and how the kinds of knowledge are produced about me. And we keep bumping into the way that others, you know, construct us. And this opens up questions of social and political inquiry for us as people of color, but it doesn't for the majority white population who are already sedimented into their historical narratives. And one of the things about this, I was debating, because I'm involved in the National Archives and a lot of archive projects, and I was asked by the British Library to talk with various archival people, and and it was for the 100 years of the suffragettes, which was last year, and on the stage was Sarah Gavron, who was the director of the suffragette movie, and of course the suffragette movie has no people of color as part of the narrative. And so on the stage I said to her, well, you know, what about the Indian women suffragettes? And she said, completely as if it wasn't a problem, they didn't fit the narrative for the film. They didn't fit the narrative. She says, I know about them, but they didn't fit the narrative. So they were conveniently cut out. And so what does that do for our children in schools? What does that say about how the narrative is constructed and who is constructing that? A white feminist erasing women of color who are feminists, because it doesn't fit the narrative. And also there was a whole thing about the T-shirt, because they said, you know, I'd rather be a rebel than a slave. And Meryl Streep wore this T-shirt to promote the film. I'd rather be a rebel than a slave. To be enslaved wasn't a choice. And that T-shirt caused a whole upheaval, you know, amongst women of color, because they were saying, you know, the idea that, you know, you'd rather be a rebel than a slave. Do you know about the inhuman conditions that it is to be a slave? The rape, you know, the brutality, the, you know, decimation of families. I mean, all of this is just erased in one statement: you didn't fit the narrative. And this is what happens to history in our schools. And then it's left to scholars of color to then become the historians. And there's only what? If there's only like 345 women professors in different disciplines, who's going to be writing these books? It has to be our white allies and our white colleagues. And they have to step forward. And I have to say, there is one person called Nick Draper who is very impressive. I don't know if you've heard of the UCL project, Legacies of British Slave Ownership, but it's with Catherine Hall, the wife of Stuart Hall, and Nick Draper, who was a banker. And he noticed that when you look at the compensation that was given to slave owners, this is what fueled, not Wilberforce didn't fuel the abolition of enslavement. It was the generous compensation which ran into millions, if not billions, much more than the compensation for 2008 with the banks that happened here. It was on a massive scale. And so that kind of erasure is really interesting. But I just want to say that the only thing that I found written about these women was by the governor of India, the Viceroy of India. And he said, these women are picturesque, striking in their oriental dress. And that's it. He talked about their clothes. So here you have them marching for women's rights. And, you know, the white feminists are seen as the only legitimate subjects of change. These women are seen as passive, mute. Chandra Mohanty, who wrote a wonderful piece called Under Western Eyes, says they're seen as mute, visible objects. They have no voice. They're in the dark. They're behind the scenes. And so, and the exotic gaze, so they're seen as exotic and multiculturalism, and this is what we do. We have, I don't know, International Students' Days when we try each other's food and wear each other's costumes and whatever, and that's meant to be equality. So, you know, that's the exotic gaze, as opposed to, you know, acknowledging difference, you know, the absolute core of difference. So they, you know, so you can, and so the feminists were seen as staunch and unfeminized, but they were seen as feminized exotic creatures. Do you see? So I find that really, you know, that for women of color, it's impossible to escape the body, that we're always constructed by how we look and how we are perceived by some notion that is outside of ourselves, that has been constructed for us. So, how am I doing for time? Oh no, I've heard this before. So I want to fast forward now to look at some of the research that I did for a book called Respecting Difference, which is on teacher educators of color, and working with, as there are mainly white tutors. They were all white tutors. And what I want to look at in this slide is how race, faith, gender is written on the body in Islamophobic times. And so here we have a tutor who was tutoring a young Muslim woman in her teaching practice. And this man, I'm going to call him John, and John says, you know, he's telling me, Muslim women make poor teachers. They're too passive and acquiescent to teach effectively. He's telling me this, okay? And he insisted this was an accurate assessment of all Muslim women teachers. And then he admitted that he was very hard on her because she had been failing and he was her tutor, that he had been really hard on her for this reason. What do we have here if we start to look at deconstruct this? Well, firstly, you know, Frantz Fanon calls it the epidermalization of the skin. So what Frantz Fanon is talking about in this epidermalization of the skin is how the skin is seen and constructed in social reality. And he gives an example, he says, you know, so Frantz Fanon was this very well-educated Martinican psychologist in the 1930s. And he was also an activist in Algeria and other places. He was just an incredible person. And he was, you know, spoke French fluently because Martinique was a colony of France. And he said he went to Paris to do some medical exams. And he's walking down a subway and a little child says, "Mama, look, a black man." And he says, at that moment, I heard tom-toms. I heard Tarzan swinging through the trees. I heard all the, you know, the construction of what an African is. At that moment, he became that. He wasn't a doctor. He wasn't a scholar. He was, you know, the African cannibal in the jungle. And that's what happens when you walk into a room as a person of color. You are what you walk into the door, and you are what you are perceived to be rather than what you are. And so for Kalila, I've written a paper called The Second Skin, where the hijab is seen as epidermalization. When she walks through the door, what do we see? We see an oppressed woman. We see a woman, you know, belonging to a barbaric culture. But she could also be dangerous. She could be a terrorist. So we have all these constructions that exist outside of ourselves. And no matter how complex we are as individuals, we are not seen as that complex individual. And so this is a cultural form, a religious and cultural form of epidermalization. And what is interesting about it is that the woman's body has become the battlefield for Islamophobia. Her dress is overdetermined. She's seen as a legitimate focus for comment and ridicule. And he ridicules her. He says, you know, he has the authority to judge her. All Muslim women, all of them, are like this. He believes he has that authority. You know, this kind of entitlement to judge others. He has no understanding of her. There's a wonderful scholar who's just recently passed away called Saba Mahmoud, and she talks about, you know, the piety and the spirituality that these women embody and how that's what drives them to wear the veil. It isn't all the things that we have in our heads in the West. And, you know, he sees her as a victim. He was harder on her for this reason, a victim in need of saving. And again, Gayatri Spivak talks about, you know, brown, help me with this one, it's brown men having to save brown women from brown men. This is like, you know, Cherry Blair and what's her name just made a comment. Cherry Blair, yes, she's back again, saying, you know, all African women are raped. And she did in the 90s talk about wanting to save women from the Taliban. I mean, there are issues of human rights and everything, but it's the construction that I'm interested in here, that they need saving. White men have to save brown women from brown men. That's what Gayatri Spivak says. And she's seen as weak and acquiescent. And it's underscored by this total misrecognition that I was talking about earlier, a misrecognition about who she really is. And that can be an experience over and over again in tutorials, over and over again in the classroom. And what kinds of opportunities then arise from this? So I just want to quickly, in my brief 5 minutes, look at how can we then decolonize our pedagogies. There are so many multiple levels, but I liked this very quick and easy way of us to begin a discussion, or you can take it forward and begin a discussion. Because again, Chandra Mohanty, who wrote Under Western Eyes, but she revisited her original paper in 2003, and she talks about, she's very much a sort of Marxist, anti-capitalist writer, and she talks about the different ways in which people of colour are taught about in the curriculum. And just to start it off, there's somebody called Linda Alcoff who's written a very famous piece called Speaking for Others. How can we speak for others? How do we listen to others? And it's an old piece, but it's a very powerful piece. And she says, if perceptually seeing race was all there was to understanding race, then a remedy would just to unlearn such seeing. And what do we have? We've got unconscious bias training, which is just saying, hey, just unlearn your prejudices. But she says that's not going to lead to anything, because what really needs changing is not the seeing race, but the ideology behind such visual perception. What is the ideology behind it? It's whiteness. It's white privilege. It's institutionalized in the fabric of our buildings. Even the pillars, when I came up here, what does it say? The pillars of the buildings, patriarchal, heteropatriarchal institutions, white heteropatriarchal institutions. What do our nation states say with Trump and Boris and Gove and all these hideous people? What are they saying to us? They're saying these people embody authority and power. So it's not just the seeing race, but what are the ideologies behind such visual perceptions? How did they come about over time? And so in this, what she says, she looks particularly at women's studies, and I'll just talk about what she says. She says, firstly, there's the tourist add and stir. So here we have forays into non-Euro-American lives. So you might have special sessions, a one-day session or one session a week on something like women working in Nike factories or dowry murders, always these sensationalizing things, on the sexist cultures and practices of others. And it doesn't address the power relations. It remains totally untouched. And then secondly, she calls it crafting the third, so she calls a tourist. It's like when you go on the beach and you go to the Caribbean, or you don't get involved, but you know that there are bad things going on, so you just teach about it. And she says it's called crafting third world difference. The second is the explorer. And I find this a really pernicious one. They love here those explorer programs where they go out, and there's Stacey Dooley's always going around, and David Lammy's just lambasted her, I won't go into that. But this idea of the them and us, the colonial gaze, it's what we call cultural relativism. Cultural relativism is a them and us, and so like in women's studies, there would be area studies, where, you know, that you look like Latin American studies or African studies or something like this. So foreign women are both subject and object of the study. They're separate, kind of, you know, equal in the way that they're looked at. And they explore differences between cultures. And the whole idea of social justice and agency is silenced in this model. And then finally, you know, in Explorers, I hate those motorbike shows where those guys go on motorbikes all over Europe and go to China. And there's one called, they're running around without taking a railroad. Yeah, and they have to go all through Tashkent and to China. It's like the new colonialism, I swear. It's just so obscene. And then now there's solidarity, and then finally she says the solidarity model is the one to go with, because the solidarity model is actually about the co-constitution of the local and the global. And this is like, this is about the comparative interweaving of commonalities and differences, of the histories. So it's like looking at how did this build, asking yourself, how did this building get built? How did Lancashire, we are in Lancashire, how did Lancashire become wealthy enough to have an institution like this? It's built on the slave trade and cotton. And where was cotton grown? And links to India, links to Africa, links to the slave trade. But that remains a silent part. When you have your convocation ceremonies, does anybody invoke these injustices on which the wealth of this nation is built? No. In Canada, they are trying to pay reparations in the sense of always invoking, I mean, they're trying to, I mean, you know, I won't even go into what they're doing to Indigenous people there, you know, the land theft, but at least they allow them to do an invocation before they start a seminar, so that you remember that it's a white settler society. I've got 2 minutes. Okay, so yes, the solidarity is to understand the proximity of power relations in anything that we teach. And so I just, in the final slide, want to just talk about how do we, you know, there's so much in each one, but, you know, how do we enact equality? And how do we as professionals then find our principles and our ethics? And what kind of change do we really want to see? I think these are all massive questions, because what are you prepared to give up as people with white privilege? And I'll put myself in that too, you know. I'm part of the system of white privilege. You know, what are we prepared to give up? And I've used this example, like I had a job with Marks and Spencer's when I first took my early retirement as a consultant, and they said, Heidi, can you go out and, you know, help women in India in our factories, you know, to give them better health care and education and so on. I said, are you prepared for what it means if they have those, if they become unionized in the way that, you know, will bring about change? And that means you will have to pay more, your profits will reduce, and, you know, there'll be a whole catalogue of events from that. If you really give people their equality, you cannot oppress them, you cannot exploit them. Well, the project did not continue, needless to say. But, you know, what kind of change do we want? And then what are our principles and ethics? I think this is really interesting. If we haven't got time to talk about it, maybe do this. You know, there's a lot of talk now about the snowflake generation and the idea of safe spaces, that somehow we should not, and freedom of speech, that, you know, lots of young scholars and activists are saying they need their own, as the women's movement did in the 70s, their own space in which to gather their strength in order to be able to fight the system. And so, you know, safe spaces have been seen as against freedom of speech. And you get all these white people saying, well, why can't I come? You know, I'm oppressed too. So there's a whole thing about social justice pedagogy that uses experience. Everyone's experience matters. And if everyone's experience matters, then the white students and the black students should be equal. But they're not equal because power relations always matter. So I don't have enough time to really develop this, but we can talk about those things. But I just wanted to leave you on an interesting note. Bell Hooks, again, the black feminist, in her book Teaching to Transgress, and I'm sure that you know this really wonderful book, but she says, you know, the academy is not paradise, but learning is a place of paradise that can be created. The classroom, with all its limitations, remains a location of possibility, a place to demand for ourselves and our comrades an open mind and heart that allows us to face reality, to move beyond boundaries, to transgress. This is education for the practice of freedom. And I always say we're so privileged to be in our institutions because we have the power to change and transgress. Thank you.